Okay, boys and girls, here we go. Hopefully you got a good break in between watching these videos. I know watching these videos can be a little bit rough. I did not realize how long that first one was going to be. I would have broken it up a little bit more evenly, but I'm going to try to keep this one a little bit more concise, a little bit tighter. But just to be honest, I'm cramming in literally, you know, 5,000 years worth of costume and fashion history into a quick little segment. So bear with me, we're almost there. So let's talk about what's called the Romantic Era. It has nothing to do with romance or people falling in love. It's called the Romantic Era because it harkens back to certain ideas that were in the Roman Empire, not necessarily in fashion, but in other ideals. But if you look at these pictures right here, you can see the hourglass figure for the women, those big poofy sleeves, which look kind of like what we saw in the Renaissance, still wearing corsets, keeping a skinny waist. And then you start seeing that big, wide flare at the bottom. This is the time of what we would call hoop skirts. Hoop skirts, as I talked about a little bit in the first video, if you can think about like having a small hula hoop going to a little bit bigger hula hoop to a bigger hula hoop all the way to the biggest hula hoop at the bottom, kind of giving a cone shape to the dress. Is it quite like a farthingale, the big metal cage thing? No, it's a little bit lighter weight, but still kind of uncomfortable. So you'd put on the hoop skirt, then you'd put petticoat on top of that, petticoat on top of that, petticoat on top of that. Then you'd put the dress on. And of course, you'd be wearing the corset all along. Gentlemen, you start looking more and more like you're wearing modern clothes. Not that those are modern clothes that they're wearing, but pants, jackets, shirts, your basic suit setup. This time period, the Romantic Era, is the time of the Civil War. So if you think like that looks like the stovepipe hat of President Lincoln, you are correct. This is also going into like more of like the Old West style of fashion. So as you can see in these pictures right here, you have a blushing bride right there in the middle. And then off to your left, you see women wearing what are called bonnets. Bonnets are still sometimes worn by little babies, especially during like the springtime, like now, to keep the sun off their sensitive skin. But the bonnets were a big popular time. You would still have those things called bustles, the wad of fabric that would kind of make the bouncy butt look going for you. Examples of this would be Annie Get Your Gun is a very popular musical. Follows the story of Annie Oakley and Buffalo Bill Hickok or Wild Bill Hickok. And essentially, follows the story of them falling in love, falling out of love, and eventually they fall back in love. The very typical musical storyline. But it does take place in the Old West. Another one is Back to the Future 3. This is a very complex storyline, so stay with me on it. It follows the story of Marty McFly, who's from the 1980s, but gets stuck in the 1950s and then still has to go back to the 1880s. So essentially, the costume designer had the challenge of not only costuming the Old West, where they end up in 1885, but also the picture on the far left is what people in the 1950s thought people in the 1880s dressed like. So as a costume designer, he was essentially setting up, costumes for several different eras, all for one movie. And sometimes those eras mixed together. And it's very odd and very strange. Probably my least favorite of the Back to the Future franchise, but, still good nonetheless. Love some Back to the Future. All right. The Victorian era. So this is 1890 to 1920. The Victoria area is named after Queen Victoria, who was in power in England at the time. If you look at the men's clothes on the left, yes, we're starting to get into like more like just basic suits, shirt, tie, different types of hats, bowler hats, straw hats, all kinds of hats. If you look at the ladies, you still have that hourglass figure, but there's no more hoop skirts, less use of the bustle, still some use of the bustle, but not a lot of use of this bustle. You would still have corsets and the hats, ladies. Oh, the hats were just so dynamic in that time period. So if you look at the ladies here on the left, you'll also see there was a great improvements in technology in textiles and sewing. So you can see that they now are able to sew more fringes. They're mixing fabrics more and more. That's a huge part of this era, especially for women. Gentlemen, your suits are becoming more fitted, but ultimately there's not much of a change from the Revolution era to the Victorian era. except for maybe some of the lengths of the jackets and such. So, for instance, Mary Poppins, of course, from Broadway and also from the popular movie. Mary Poppins Returns is not quite this era. It's close, but it's not quite the same era. We talked about The Music Man on one of our musical Mondays. This would have been from the era, so you can see those big, lovely hats on the ladies on the left. And then the children on the right, you actually start seeing some children fashion, not just smaller version of what grown-ups would wear, but actually clothes that are made for children. And I know a lot of you love this show, Newsies, which was the Disney movie first, and then they made it into a Broadway show, and they did it at Stratford a couple of years ago, which was wonderful, wonderful production. But you can see that this is what they would have dressed like more in New York City, whereas in a smaller town, the fashion would be a little bit different. So when we talked about fashion designers, time period and location, a little bit different. And then we did a show called Oklahoma. For instance, looking back at Newsies, a little bit of a different fashion from, say, small town Oklahoma during the same time frame. So, in fact, a lot of the 8th graders from this Oklahoma cast are now seniors this year at Stratford. So it's fun to see these familiar faces. Anyway, moving on. Wonder Woman also would have been during this era. In fact, there's a very funny scene where Wonder Woman herself goes, she gets away from the island of Miniskira. Yeah, that's it. And she ends up in London, where she actually has to be like dressed, and there's this whole like funny scene where she's getting dressed and she's like, this is so stupid, why do women dress this way? And she's right, it was kind of stupid the way that they would dress. Very fashionable, but definitely not practical, especially if you're a warrior. All right, now the Roaring 20s, 1920s to 1935. I don't want to alarm you folks, but there's something very scandalous in this picture we see on the left and the right. Ladies, if you've noticed, you can see the women's ankles. Yes, quite scandalous. This is the first time in history where seeing a woman's ankles wasn't considered a scandal. So wonderful by that. You also notice the waistline for the women's fashion drops below the hips. Your waistline is about where your belly button is. That's your true waistline when we're talking about fashion and clothing. But ultimately, this time the fashion drops below the hips. So it makes the torso look really long, but the legs look a little bit shorter, if you can't notice that there. You also notice that the hats the women are wearing are a little bit tighter to the head. Some are a little bit bigger, but ultimately you have these, skull caps, essentially. They're tight to the head. Men, your fashion, once again, does not change much. And if you see it, that image on the right there, on the far right, that's actually what we call a flapper dress for women, which would have a lot of sequins and tassels and things. And it's called a flapper dress because when you would dance a certain way, they would actually the material would actually flap around. Examples would be like this film called The Great Gatsby. It's based on a book called The Great Gatsby. Wonderful, wonderful costumes in that, and it is very accurate to the 1920s. The director and costume designer did an excellent job with that. But you may remember this one, The Drowsy Chaperone. We just saw this one. So that would be an example of 1920s fashion. So the picture on the left is the cast from Stratford High School, and the picture on the right is just another theater. But I chose this picture because if you see the green dress the woman is wearing in front, that's an example of a flapper dress. Yeah, it's kind of flapping around there. And of course, Annie from last year would be an example of the Roaring 20s. Oh, someone's contacting me on my phone. Cool. Moving on. In the 1940s, so ladies, once again, we still get to see your ankles. And in fact, you get to really loosen up here a little bit. There are no more corsets you're seeing in the 1940s and not even the 1920s. I should have recognized that earlier. 1920s, no more corsets either. 1940s, a little bit looser there. Gentlemen, the 1940s, your waistline would be brought way up to above the belly button. So whereas before in the 1920s, the waistline dropped for the women, in the 1940s, the waistline kind of went up for the gentlemen to make you look like you had very long legs and a short torso. Not sure why they did that, but that was the style at the time. Also very common in this time were things called zoot suits, which were big baggy suits, not like slim and fit to you, but like they were meant to be very loose and things like that. So these are actual ads from stores at the time, especially the one on the left there. You see they're advertising a men's two-piece suit, meaning there's no longer vests required for your suits there. Um, Now, movies from this would be It's a Wonderful Life. It's an older one. It's a Christmas movie, but I love it. It's great. It was made in the 1940s, so the fashions look like 1940s. Anything around World War II would be considered to be like this era for fashion. And then Captain America, or there was a short-lived TV show called Agent Carter, which is based in that universe, would have also been during the 1940s. The 1950s, you start getting into very unique styles for women and men. It's not just this is the way you dress and this is the way you dress. You get a lot more options. If you look at the picture on the left with the girl, she has little monkeys that are like on her skirt. Animal prints on any clothing back then were very common. You may have heard of the term poodle skirt before. Well, it wasn't just limited to poodles. As you can see, there are monkeys right there. There are other examples of like elephants and giraffes and little kitties and things like that. It wasn't just poodle skirts, even though that is the most common phrase. The men on the right are demonstrating are showing the greaser look, which had been in blue jeans, which started coming into fashion in the 1950s. They were around in the 1940s, but mainly in the 1950s, people would be wearing blue jeans more and more. But the greaser look would have like slicked back hair, usually a plain shirt of some kind, a jacket, and just blue jeans. Examples would be like, speaking of greasers, the film Grease, even though it was made in 1978, it takes place in the 1950s. And then West Side Story, which we talked about a lot during our musical theater. These are actually images from the upcoming film version that's coming out, which I'm really excited because it looks like they stayed very true to the 1950s style. And you can always come back and look at that. But moving on, the 1960s. 1960s is hard to kind of like narrow it down to just like 10 years because as we move forward in time, fashion becomes much more, specific to specific groups as well as specific years. So the 1960s, these would be more popular styles. So for instance, you start getting into, like prints on dresses. You also see that skirt lines come above the knee for the first time in the 1960s. Some people did not like that very much, but that was how it went. The image of the gentleman in the bottom right there is the band The Temptations. If you remember us talking about Ain't Too Proud to Beg, the musical that is technically still on Broadway right now. You would see a lot of these, essentially the boy groups, the men groups of the time. They would be dressed all similarly, as well as the girl groups at the time. Things like like the Supremes and the Ronettes. All right. So an example would be like Hairspray would be a good example from the 1960s, as well as, like I said, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, or Ain't Too Proud. You also had something called the counterculture during the 1960s, which would have been like the hippie movement. Then it was just kind of a free-for-all. If it felt good, you wore it. And that's just kind of how it went, including the group on the right there. That's a group called the Beatles, which maybe you've heard of. They were, as they moved on their career, they definitely embraced that hippie lifestyle and culture. 1970s, once again, you can break this into many different subgenres and things like that, but let's hit the big ones. First of all, bell-bottom pants were very popular at the time. We'll see some examples of that in a second. You also had these things called polyester suits, which were no longer cotton or wool or silk suits, but they're actually very uncomfortable to wear. But the good thing about polyester is that because it's not a natural fabric, it would still wrinkle, but the wrinkles would come out very easily because polyester is actually kind of a plastic. So you're kind of wearing a plastic suit. But as you can see, this is more devoted to the men's fashion. The clothes were much tighter to the body, but still very wide at the bottom. And then for the women, as you can see, the bell bottoms there on the left, how it's covering up the entire shoe. Speaking of shoes, on the right, you can see what are called platform shoes. These would have been worn by men and women alike. They may not have been strappy sandal type for the men, but they too would be wearing platform shoes. Examples of the 1970s would be like a group called the Brady Bunch, a TV show. Once again, you can see there's a lot of variety with kids' clothes during this time. It's not just like one style. You had a lot to choose from going from the 60s into the 70s. Some people are talking about the Brady Bunch now because it kind of has what we call like the zoom view, because the show would always start with like this kind of look with like the different blocks and things like that and everybody popping up. And then like now when we look at the zoom view, it kind of has that feeling now. Going into the 1980s, we had a lot of different groups going on at the time. You had things that were called like glam rockers. You'd have punk rockers. Hip hop rap was coming on to the scene. So once again, as we get closer to modern times, like you can really start breaking it down into more specific groups. So the glam rockers would wear a lot of different, like, big spray paint, bright colors, a lot of makeup all over the place. For instance, the group there in the middle, that is a group of gentlemen, wearing a lot of makeup and things. That's just the style. The woman on the left, a woman named Cyndi Lauper, also popular at the time, was also a woman named Madonna, who's still kind of making music here and there. And then the punk rockers in the middle with like the big, like, spikes and all the studs on their jackets. And then the group on the far right, that's a group called Run DMC, which was very popular in the New York rap scene. It actually started in the 1970s, but really came into its own into the 1980s. In the 1980s, you had this group called the Brat Pack, which is very popular in movies. They made several films, but the two most popular as they were teenagers were Pretty in Pink and The Breakfast Club. There are others out there, but either way, they this is a more common look of what most people would wear to school when they were in high school and such. Another good example would be a film called Footloose, starring Kevin Bacon. So if you've ever seen Guardians of the Galaxy, they actually reference Footloose. So that's the guy. That's him. That's Kevin Bacon. They actually made it into an actual Broadway show later on. And, both are very good. Both are very good. Yeah, if you enjoy that. 1990s. Here we go. I went away for a second because I want you to see all these different styles that were in the 1990s. You had like the skater culture was coming into its own with big baggy pants in that top left picture. You had what was called grunge. Grunge was actually something that wasn't even really a style, but it became popular because people started listening to music out of what's called the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, and they were just kind of like copying, well, what do they wear up there? And they were mostly wearing clothes because it was cold up there, but then it became its own like fashion unto itself. The picture in the top right corner is a show called Beverly Hills 90210, which was very popular in the 90s. A good example of what people would have worn, like once again on a daily basis. And then down at the bottom middle, that is Will Smith and DJ Jazzy Jeff from the show Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. They actually had a rap career before they made the TV show, but still very good. And then the bottom image right down there, once again, the hip hop movement. The bottom right is actually a guy named Lil Wayne. Maybe you've heard of him. And so that's the 90s. Other shows for the 90s besides Beverly Hills 90210 would be like Kenan and Kel, which was a popular Nickelodeon like sketch comedy show. Actually, Kenan right there, Kenan Thomas, actually went on to be on Saturday Night Live, still on it now. And Saved by the Bell is another example of fashion from the 90s. Now, we could get into the 2000s, but the 2000s have not really changed too much from what we're wearing now. So the question is, what will fashion be like in the future? Well, remember we talked about Back to the Future earlier? Well, Back to the Future 2 took place in the year 2015. So technically, 5 years ago, we were supposed to be dressing like all of these people in this figure, these images right now. So that's a little bit nuts to think about. We didn't quite make it that far. We made it close in some ways, but we're not exactly wearing the fly swatter hat that a young Elijah Wood is wearing right there. We're not wearing, like the face tattoos to make us look like, cyborg robots just yet. Some people might be, but it's definitely not commonplace. We're not wearing, these weird, jackets that look like you could be like coming out of like some futuristic robot city. Ultimately, the costume designers had some fun with it when they made the movie. Didn't quite get too accurate, but still a lot of fun. So ultimately, that's it in a nutshell. Let's take a look at your project for this week. This is the week 5 project. Number 1, your job is to create a costume design for 3 of the characters from the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. So think back to last semester. I did post the video that was a review video for the final exam in this slideshow, so you can go back and find that later. And the character list as well. But you're going to have to choose 3 of the characters we talked about in class, and then you're going to have to actually design costumes for them. For this week, for week 5, you do not actually have to go draw out, sketch out, paint out, or anything like that. I don't want you to. Save that. That's for next week. But this week, you're going to have to choose the 3 characters, and you're going to have to choose one specific time period that you want to design them. It can be from the Renaissance era when it was originally performed in 1591. It could be from the Old West. It could be from ancient Greece. It could be from, right now, 2020. It could be from the year 2050. It could be in the future. It's up to you. That's your call. So this is what is due this week. On Thursday, you need to send me in the little submission video. You don't need to do a Google link. You can just type it in there. All I need are the 3 characters that you're going to be designing for. That's all I need by Thursday. All right. One has to be a male character. One has to be a female character. The other one can be your choice. All right. So it could be 2 boys, 1 girl, 2 girls, 1 boy. Your call. All right. But either way, you have to send me which 3 characters you're doing. I need you to think this ahead. That's due on Thursday. Easy A, super duper, but it is homework. You need to get that done. On Sunday, you're going to have to create a Google slideshow with pictures that you can find online that will inspire your costume designs. So don't look up Romeo Old West. No, just look up Old West and see if you can find images that will inspire your costume. So we're not looking for one specific look. We're just looking for things that might inspire whatever look we land on. So there's an example. So click on the example in the slideshow. It's right here on the bottom of this slide. So you can figure that out. All right. So you're going to have 1 slide for each character, and you have to have at least 5 pictures for each character. Do a Google search. You can find the images. I promise you, it's not that difficult. I did one myself. Yes, I've done this before, so I kind of have an easier time with it, but it's not going to take you too much time, guys. I promise you it's not that hard. Moving forward, here are the list of all the characters, in case you had forgotten them. And at the bottom, once again, there's the link for the video, so if you need a reminder on what the actual story is that can help you out. All right, so that's it, guys. I think I went a little over my 10-minute goal, but that's okay. I'm okay. We're all okay. All right, this is going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait to see what characters you choose. And once again, I'm not asking you to design the actual costumes yet. Job number 1, going back a slide, it's due Thursday. Just send me your 3 characters. That's all I need. That's 1 homework grade. That's it. Perfect. Easy A. Second one, that's when you're going to have to look at my example and create a Google slideshow and then just share the link. Just share the link. You can make it shareable. Click on the top right-hand corner and you can share it with me in the submission section of the homework. I promise you it's super easy. You can figure it out. All right, guys, that's it for me. I will be seeing you soon. Don't forget to join in on those Zooms if you can, because it's helpful to see one another, and it's helpful for you so you can ask any questions you might have. All right, all that being said, hope you guys have a great week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.